Imagine watching someone you once knew as intensely perceptive, the kind of person others leaned on when they needed to feel truly understood, slowly step into a silence so complete it almost feels like a reproach. They no longer offer the same tenderness, no longer seek to decode every hidden wound. In moments that once demanded their full emotional presence, they now hold back. And your mind fills in the gap. They've grown cold. They've stopped caring. But Carl Jung would have seen this exact shift and called it something radically different. Not a loss of heart, but the final, irreversible stage of awakening. When the empath stops caring in the way everyone expects, they do not lose their compassion. They withdraw in endless projection and begin to reclaim the parts of themselves they abandoned long ago. If you've been unsettled by someone's new distance, or if you yourself feel unable to carry the world's weight the way you once did, what follows might not be a breakdown. It might be the moment you actually wake up. Stay with this until the final word, because by the end, the way you see that person and yourself may alter permanently. Why the empath must stop caring in order to reach the final stage of awakening. There arrives a point in every deep feeler's life when they are forced to revisit what they once considered their finest trait, and they stumble across a truth that sits painfully. They never made a free choice to care. That seemingly noble reflex did not flow from an abundant inner source. It was sculpted by a psychological architecture laid down early, where turning outward to soothe, to harmonize, to absorb, became the unspoken price of staying connected. They learned to decode others' silences before they ever asked for their own silence to be seen. They mastered the art of shape-shifting, adjusting their tone, their needs, their entire presence, just to avoid the risk of rejection. And somewhere along the way, a survival strategy was mistaken for identity. From the Jungian angle, this is not mature compassion. It is unconscious identification, a state where the person has not yet separated from the expectations that molded them. When internal boundaries are absent, a person does not just encounter the world, they are swallowed by it. The empath does not merely feel, they merge. They do not simply listen, they internalize. And it is precisely this fusion that dismantles their ability to distinguish which emotions originate in themselves and which belong to someone else. The real issue, then, is not that they give too much. It is that they have no stable center to step back into. Their sense of self was never built from within. It was mirrored back to them through how much they could become a holding environment for others. And when a human being exists in a perpetual outward orientation like this, burnout is not a risk. It is a mathematical certainty. The psyche cannot endlessly pour out without refilling its own well. And for the empath, the well was never truly theirs. So awakening does not begin by teaching them to care more skillfully. It begins with an act that seems to violate everything they think they stand for. Stopping. Not because love has evaporated, but because the old machinery of caring has become unsustainable. The moment an empath begins to halt the reflexive care response, a new space opens. A necessary distance emerges. And within that distance, something primitive yet forgotten stirs, the ability to perceive oneself as a separate being. For the first time, they can remain emotionally present without being submerged. They can feel the sadness of another without mistaking it as their own emergency. They can listen deeply without absorbing the other's state into their nervous system. This is not the death of compassion. It is its reorganization from an unconscious, compulsive flow into a conscious, deliberate act. Jung insisted that a person only grows into real maturity when they are no longer operated by what runs unconsciously behind their back. For the empath, that means passing through a crucible where the old way of caring, the way fused with self-loss, must be abandoned entirely. If they continue in the same mode, they are not serving love. They are repeating a pattern that systematically erases them. So when they stop, it is not a sign of emotional decay. It is a necessary recalibration. in which the empath withdraws their unconscious identifications, rebuilds lost boundaries, and starts to live, for the first time perhaps, from an inner axis, rather than from the magnetic pull of everyone else's needs. And here lies the paradox. They don't stop because they read a philosophy or followed a luminous piece of advice. They stop when the old fuel runs out, when the body refuses, when the persona can no longer sustain the performance, when the cost of the old pattern finally outweighs the fragile sense of belonging it once purchased. And to understand what powered that pattern for so long, we must descend to its deeper origin, the moment the empath reaches the final stage of awakening. 1. The empath recognizes they have been drained in an energy economy. Awakening rarely announces itself with a catastrophic event. It often tiptoes in during the most unremarkable moments. A quiet evening, no different from any other. The empath sits down after a long day, and a heavy, inexplicable exhaustion settles in. Not the tiredness of physical labor or a bad night's sleep, but a hollow depletion that seems to hum from somewhere deeper, as if a vital resource has been slowly siphoned without their knowledge. As they trace the day backward, they find the culprit was not what they did, but what they felt. They listened too intensely. They understood excessively. They made themselves emotionally available to the point of disappearing. And each of those interactions quietly extracted a fee. This moment ignites a startling revelation. Relationships, beneath the layer of affection and moral intention, operate on an invisible currency, psychic energy. An exchange is always running, a current passing between people. But the empath was never in a balanced exchange. They were not a participant in a mutual flow. They gradually became a source, an emotional reserve for others to tap. For years they confused this with sincere connection. But eventually, a hidden structure reveals itself. Those who are more grounded, more resilient, more willing to hold space, often become the repository where others deposit what they cannot bear to carry themselves. Anxiety, pressure, dormant fury, inner chaos, these do not magically vanish. They are transferred. They are handed over through conversations that begin with "I just need you to understand," through confessions that are really requests for emotional storage. And the empath, by instinct, opens their vault and takes it all in, never pausing to calculate the transaction. At first, this arrangement can feel like purpose. Being needed can simulate worth. But slowly, the imbalance calcifies. They give continuously, receiving only the quiet relief of the other, rarely replenishment. They become an emotional transit hub, not by design, but because they never learned to shut the intake valve. People begin to appear in their life as if the empath were a default solution. A distressed friend turns toward them instead of turning toward her own self-confrontation. A fractured family system stabilizes because the empath absorbs the tensions. A demanding workplace hums because they silently carry the emotional debris that others refuse to pick up. They become structural support for systems that are already cracking, and no one asks whether that support has any strength left. And then the reckoning comes, not through an abstract insight, but through the undeniable bodily experience of emptiness. I recall a woman I once worked with, Mira, who had lived in this rhythm for over a decade. Every evening, one friend after another poured their turmoil into her, and she carried those stories home like they were woven into her own cells. One Sunday, after a series of calls that drained her completely, she found she didn't have the energy to make a simple cup of tea. Not sadness, not boredom, a total inner vacancy. It was only when she began to examine her life through a conscious lens that she understood. What had exhausted her was not existence itself, but the accumulated emotional cargo of other people's lives she had been hauling. Cargo that was never hers to carry. Her body had signaled the overload long before her mind caught up. From this threshold, the empath starts to survey all their relationships through a cold, clarifying lens. They see patterns they had romanticized, Many connections are sustained not by mutual nourishment, but by a one-directional flow. They are always the one giving, others always receiving. And when they attempt even a minor retreat, when they stop being as emotionally accessible, the imbalance becomes instantly visible. Others become uncomfortable, perplexed, sometimes resentful, not because the empath has done anything wrong, but because the familiar source of supply has been interrupted. Modern psychology has a term that maps onto this: emotional labor. The continuous processing and carrying of others' affective states consumes cognitive resources comparable to performing intense mental work. When this depletion occurs without restoration, the nervous system flips into a protective mode, manifesting as withdrawal, diminished responsiveness, or even emotional numbness. So the empath's decision to stop caring in the old reflexive way is not a moral failure. It is a survival response, an attempt by the psyche to prevent its own collapse. At a deeper level, this is the moment when energy that once perpetually flowed outward begins to course inward again. The empath stops signing blank checks with their vitality. They begin to erect boundaries, not to wall out the world, but to restore an internal equilibrium that was never supposed to be absent. This shift does not sour their compassion. It simply terminates a long-standing imbalance. When they finally recognize that their energy is finite and inherently precious, the care they later offer is no longer an unconscious leak. It is a conscious gift, one that nourishes both sides. Pause for a moment and be radically honest with yourself. Have you tasted this? Have you sensed that you poured out your energy relentlessly, only to discover that when you yourself were in need, the return was either absent or painfully meager? If that rings true, you don't need to announce it aloud. You can acknowledge it silently as an act of internal release. And perhaps this also grants you a new lens on someone you've been mourning, someone whose distance you misread as coldness. It's possible their withdrawal was never about losing heart. It was the embryonic stage of their awakening, an attempt to preserve what little of themselves remained. And once this one-directional flow becomes visible, an even more unsettling realization begins to surface. It's not only their energy that has been drained. Their very sense of self has been slowly dissolved inside the act of endless giving. For to sustain the role of an emotional source, they unconsciously adopted a mask that was deeply familiar and widely praised. And from here, the awakening plunges into a deeper layer, as the empath starts to step away from the social face they have worn for a lifetime. 2. The empath begins to strip away the persona. At a certain depth of inner work, the empath confronts a turning point that is quiet yet unnerving. They start to realize they have inhabited an image so thoroughly that they can no longer tell where the role ends and their authentic self begins. The image was accepted, even celebrated by the outer world, to the point of becoming a cage made of compliments. In Jung's lexicon, the persona is not inherently false. It is a necessary psychological construct, a social skin that allows the individual to move through society without constant friction. The danger arrives when the persona stops being a tool and becomes the master. For the empath, this takeover is especially insidious because the mask is not ugly. It's strikingly admirable. It is the face of the always understanding one, the gentle listener, the one who never creates conflict, the one who makes others feel safe. And precisely because that image is so welcome, the empath confuses it with their true nature. But a subtle rupture occurs. When a specific image is repeated long enough and endlessly reinforced by praise, it gradually usurps the direct experience of inner truth. Jung observed that a person can live an entire lifetime as a version of themselves that both they and others believe is real, while the living, breathing core inside is pushed further into the basement. This doesn't happen dramatically. It materializes in countless micro-moments. Each time the empath suppresses a genuine frustration to maintain the peace. Each time they smile while internally collapsing. Each time they say it's fine when they have maxed out their reserve. They are unconsciously strengthening the persona. What makes it more complex is that society consistently rewards this version. The empath is seen as mature, kind, reliable. This applause makes it excruciatingly difficult to step out of the role. Over time, a quiet inversion takes place. The authentic self is not annihilated, but it is relegated to the unconscious, while the persona moves into the foreground and claims the throne. The empath no longer experiences life as a living person with impulses and limits. They perform as an image that must be constantly maintained. The cost of this confusion is a deep internal schism. Outwardly, everything seems serene. Inside, there's a mounting sense of unfamiliarity, a feeling of being hollow. The roots of this structure often trace back to very early adaptation. Many empaths learned that attunement was not just a gift, but a condition for love. If they weren't agreeable enough, understanding enough, sacrificing enough, the connection might snap. So the persona was never a mere superficial mask. It was a survival mechanism. They depended on it to feel safe. But there comes a point when this strategy stops functioning. The empath begins to experience a very specific, arid emptiness, one that persists even as they perform the role perfectly. They keep saying the same comforting words, keep showing up in the same reliable way, but something essential has evacuated. Like an actor who still knows every line yet feels no pulse of connection to the character. They aren't sad in the ordinary sense. They are weirdly dislocated from themselves. This is often the first signal that the persona has colonized too much psychic territory. When the persona becomes the sole identity, the person loses contact with their original source of aliveness. They no longer act from a living center, but from a fossilized image of what it means to be a good person. And paradoxically, the environment conspires to lock them in. Family systems calibrate to this version. Relationships are structured around it. Any movement away from this role can be perceived by others as betrayal or malfunction. This is where a profound inner breaking point emerges. The empath is cornered into a question they've dodged for most of their life. If I am no longer this endlessly caring figure, then who am I? This is not a philosophical puzzle. It's an existential earthquake. Because as the persona begins to destabilize, the entire meaning system built on being needed also begins to fracture. And it is precisely here that authentic awakening intensifies. The moment the empath stops caring often coincides with the moment they simply lack the energy to keep propping up the familiar costume. They no longer feel compelled to please. They no longer believe that self-erasure is the only gateway to connection. From the outside, this shift may be read as indifference, even selfishness, but from the inside, it is the first breath of acting in alignment with their own truth. There's a passage that captures this dynamic with stark resonance. These people honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. In a deep sense, the persona can function exactly like this. A life of outward kindness and sacrifice that, if not rooted in inner authenticity, slowly becomes an echoing shell. When the empath stops caring in the old unconscious way, they are not abandoning morality. They are returning to a deeper honesty, where action is no longer driven by the compulsion to sustain an image, but by what is genuinely alive within. This transition is not gentle. As the persona cracks, a wave of difficult emotions surges. Guilt for not being as good as before, fear of being misread, anxiety about losing familiar roles. Yet alongside these, another sensation quietly emerges. Relief. For the first time in memory, they are no longer performing. They are no longer curating an image. And in that spacious silence, they begin to hear their own voice again. Crucially, this isn't about destroying the persona entirely. It's about returning it to its proper station. The persona persists, but it is no longer the governing center. The empath can still be kind, still be compassionate, but they are no longer enslaved by the need to be those things at all times. Their worth is no longer tethered to how much they give, but to the simple fact of their being. They start to live from the inside out. Old questions dissolve. How can I be a better person in the eyes of others? Is replaced by what is actually true for me, and what have I been abandoning within myself to sustain this image? When such questions ignite, the persona ceases to be a refuge. It becomes a constricting shell that must be shed. But shedding it does not bring instant peace. Quite the opposite. It often marks the beginning of a more intense confrontation. As the mask comes off, long repressed material begins to surface. Anger, frustration, the raw desire to withdraw, impulses they had labeled as selfish. These emerge with startling clarity. And this is the threshold where the journey moves into an even deeper phase, where the empath is no longer merely wrestling with a social mask, but with the hidden, unintegrated dimensions within. 3. The empath learns to reconcile with their inner shadow. In the inner ecosystem of an empath, the shadow does not commonly appear as overt villainy. It rarely shows up as cruelty or obvious harm. It manifests far more quietly and far more disturbingly. A long-buried anger toward the very people they try to help, a secret resentment that curdles beneath the surface, or an almost forbidden impulse to announce with brutal honesty, I no longer want to care. Yet each time these feelings flicker, the empath's immediate reflex is rejection. They label them as wrong, as inappropriate, as incompatible with the identity they've so carefully constructed. And in that instant, the shadow is shoved deeper into the unconscious, where it continues to accumulate, silently gaining mass. From a Jungian viewpoint, this is the inevitable outcome of identifying too rigidly with a one-sided moral image. When a person permits themselves only to be good, patient, and compassionate, everything that contradicts that image does not vanish. It is merely relegated to abasement, biding its time. For the empath, the shadow's expression leaks through chronic fatigue, an unexplained inner void, or sudden flashes of coldness that feel foreign and even terrifying. They cannot comprehend how they can feel so sharp, so remote, when they have always believed themselves to be fundamentally gentle. In reality, nothing new has appeared. It is simply that what was long repressed has finally forced its way to the surface. The core problem is not the existence of the shadow, but the relationship the empath maintains with it. Jung never championed the indulgence of raw instinct or the discarding of inner discipline. He pointed toward a far more unsettling truth. What remains unconscious does not disappear. It directs. The more the empath denies what they deem unacceptable emotions, the more those emotions begin to steer behavior from behind a curtain. They may believe they are helping purely out of love, while unconsciously chasing validation. They may believe they are being selfless while being driven by a terror of disconnection. Real transformation begins at a point that feels deceptively simple yet demands enormous courage. The moment the empath permits themselves to acknowledge what they have spent a lifetime avoiding. Sentences that seem modest but carry immense weight. I am angry. I do not want to continue. I need to stop. Inside the value system they were molded by, these admissions can feel like moral failures or utter betrayals of who they are supposed to be. But psychologically, they are acts of radical honesty. And it is exactly this honesty that unlocks a deeper awareness of the self. As Jung wrote, one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. For the empath, this is no poetic abstraction. It is a turning point. For so long they believed that growth meant becoming better, kinder, more endlessly understanding. Yet what they truly needed was not more light, but the courage to sit with the darkness they have persistently avoided. When they begin to approach the shadow with curiosity, rather than immediate correction, something subtle shifts. They start to observe the eruptions instead of suppressing them. They ask, Where is this feeling coming from? What is it trying to protect? What needs to be seen? In this space of non-judgment, the shadow slowly loses its destructive charge. It no longer needs to hijack behavior or leak as exhaustion, because it is finally being witnessed. Perhaps most importantly, this reconciliation dissolves one of the ego's most dangerous illusions, the fantasy of absolute purity. Jung considered this a fundamental psychological trap, one that compels individuals to perpetually disown any inner content that does not match their ideal. A mature human is not someone devoid of darkness, but someone aware of it and no longer governed by it. For the empath, this realization brings profound liberation. They no longer have to be endlessly right, endlessly gentle, endlessly amenable. They are permitted to be whole before they are anything else. At this juncture, the awakening deepens. It is no longer just about stepping out of social roles or breaking old habits, but about achieving inner coherence. Light and shadow stop standing as enemies. They begin to coexist within a unified structure. The empath does not lose their capacity to love when they accept their shadow. On the contrary, their love becomes more authentic, because it is no longer rooted in obligation or fear, but in inner freedom. And if, as you listen to this, you feel a certain heaviness stirring, it may be that in the very moments when you feel most confused about yourself, your shadow is not trying to sabotage you. It may be trying to interrupt a way of caring that has long ceased to be true. And if you have ever judged someone for withdrawing, for seeming distant, or even selfish, perhaps you can now begin to see that what you interpreted as coldness may have been a necessary step in their awakening, a silent turning toward wholeness. So take a moment and be honest with what remains inside you right now. If you're not ready to put it into words, that's fine. But you might leave a small sign, a quiet acknowledgement that something within you has been understood, and that you're willing to continue this movement forward. 4. The empath integrates anima and animus within. For much of their life, the empath operates from a psychological imbalance that is rarely named. They lean heavily toward anima, the principle of sensitivity, intuition, emotional attunement, relational depth. This is what enables them to perceive the unspoken, to feel chords that others cannot hear, to connect in ways that appear almost instinctive. It is also what makes them seem rare and beautiful. But when one pole of the psyche develops unchecked, without the counterweight of its opposite, what once was a strength gradually deforms into a structural fragility. The issue is not that the empath feels too profoundly. It is that they lack an inner axis robust enough to contain the intensity of what they feel. In Jungian terms, animus represents not merely so-called masculine energy, but the principle of clarity, discernment, structure, and the capacity to draw a line. When animus is underdeveloped, the empath is easily swallowed by emotional currents. They struggle to say no, struggle to withdraw, and collapse into the experiences of others without realizing they've dissolved their own perimeter. They resemble a body of water that is pure yet unbounded. And without boundaries, it cannot hold its own shape. At this stage of awakening, the internal shift is no longer just about recognizing that they give too much. It becomes something far more foundational. They begin to reconstruct their internal architecture so that they can remain present without dissolving. They do not abandon their empathic capacity, but they no longer allow it to operate without containment. A new quality emerges, a quiet but unmistakable precision about when to open and when to retreat. This change becomes visible in small, telling ways. In the past, when someone shared their pain, the empath would immediately step into that inner landscape, feeling alongside them, carrying alongside them, analyzing it completely. But as anima and animus begin to integrate, they still listen, yet they no longer merge. They maintain a subtle but sacred distance, enough to feel deeply, but not enough to lose the coordinates of their own self. They are no longer pulled into the current. They can stand beside it and still be present. Jung noted that every man carries within him the eternal image of woman, and every woman the image of man. This is not metaphorical decoration, but a deep psychic structure. Each individual houses both poles, and maturity only arrives when these opposites are consciously recognized and reconciled. For the empath, this means ceasing to live exclusively through feeling, and allowing discernment, limit setting, and intentionality to participate fully in how they relate to the world. This transformation rarely erupts as a dramatic breakthrough. It unfolds through small but decisive shifts. They begin to say no without offering a lengthy justification. They start to withdraw from conversations that drain them without being crushed by guilt. They start to understand that safeguarding their energy is not an act of selfishness, but a necessary precondition for offering genuine presence. At a deeper level, this is where the compulsive need to care begins to dissolve on its own. Because when the inner polarities are balanced, the very nature of care changes. It is no longer a one-directional hemorrhage, but a conscious exchange. They can still feel acutely, but they are not swept away. They can still connect intimately, but they do not lose their boundary. The softness of anima is not extinguished. It is now supported by the firmness of animus. This yields a fundamentally different way of being. The empath is no longer someone who is perpetually available, but someone who chooses, with sovereignty, where to invest their presence. They no longer attempt to heal everything. They remain only where there is genuine meaning. And through this discernment, their energy becomes coherent. It is no longer scattered or unconsciously leaked. One individual who navigated this stage described it plainly. She had always believed that truly understanding someone required absorbing their state. But she eventually discovered that understanding does not demand fusion. She could feel another's hurt without shouldering it, and for the first time she experienced connection without self-abandonment. That is the hallmark of inner integration. The empath stops being split between opposing internal forces, between loving others and preserving themselves. They can do both, not through heroic effort, but because the psyche has reorganized from within. And it is precisely here that the awakening reaches a deeper threshold. It ceases to be about modifying behavior or managing emotions. It becomes a shift in the very mode of existence. The empath no longer operates from lack or fear, but from an internal equilibrium. They no longer need to care in order to feel valuable, because that sense of value has already been established within. The paradox is unmistakable. When they no longer feel compelled to care in the old, draining way, their presence becomes more profound than ever. There is no urgency, no excess, no depletion. They are simply there, fully, without losing themselves. And according to Jung, that is one of the most definitive signs that an individual has traveled far along the path of returning to their own center. 5. The empath moves deeply into the process of individuation. From the Jungian standpoint, individuation is not about upgrading the ego or becoming a more polished version of the same self. It is about separating from unconscious identifications, so that one can gradually approach inner wholeness, the self that stands beyond all roles. For the empath, this path is exceptionally demanding, because it requires not only releasing imbalanced relationships, but also relinquishing the very identity they staked their entire existence on. And when they truly start moving into this process, a subtle yet foundational shift takes hold. They no longer feel automatically pulled into every emotional field around them. In the past, someone else's sadness or anxiety would instantly hook them, like an involuntary reflex. Now they can still perceive the same signals, but they are no longer commandeered. Like a person standing at the edge of a fast-flowing river, they observe the movement without stepping into the current. This distance is not a sign of numbness. It is a new level of clarity, where they can distinguish with precision between what belongs to them and what does not. This transformation often makes them appear strange to others. They no longer react in predictable scripts. They are no longer a constant open channel for venting or absorption. Conversations that once extended into hours now draw to a close naturally, without guilt. Relationships they once fought to preserve at any cost can now be released without excessive apology. And most significantly, they lack the internal sense of doing something wrong. That is one of the clearest indicators that individuation has taken root. As long as someone's self-worth is tethered to external validation, they remain bound to the projections and expectations of others. But when that center of gravity moves inward, actions begin to emanate from inner truth rather than from the desperate need to be accepted. Jung expressed it this way: the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. For the empath, this is not a comforting platitude. It is a deeply challenging pilgrimage. Because to become who they truly are, they must pass through a phase where they are no longer recognizable to those around them. They are no longer the one who is always there, always understanding, always bending. And this transition can bring a particular kind of loneliness, at least for a season. Yet this loneliness is qualitatively different from the old isolation. Previously, they could be surrounded by people and still feel unseen, because they weren't truly present inside their own presence. Now, even with fewer outer supports, they feel more internally aligned. They start to experience a form of groundedness that doesn't rely on becoming someone else in order to belong. At a deeper level, individuation installs a stability they may never have known. They no longer need to constantly reach outward for meaning or reassurance. They can be alone without feeling incomplete. They can hold intense emotions without the immediate reflex to analyze or fix them. Gradually, they learn to trust their own inner rhythm, instead of being shaped by the frantic beat of the external world. And from this inner stability, a different quality of care emerges. It is no longer reactive, no longer driven by the compulsion to intervene or rescue. It becomes a form of conscious, still presence. They can sit alongside another's suffering without needing to change it, because they realize that each soul walks its own path. Care at this stage is not a drain but an overflow from a stable inner well. This is where many misinterpretation occurs. From the outside, the empath at this stage may appear to have stopped caring. They respond less, intervene less, explain less. But in truth, they have not lost the capacity for love. They have simply stopped loving in a way that annihilates the self. They no longer equate deep affection with unconditional self-sacrifice. They begin to love from a place that does not demand self-abandonment. That is what it means for an individual to have gone deep. Not that they have become flawless, but that they have become more whole. Not that their shadow has vanished, but that it no longer governs their choices. Not that they have retreated from the world, but that they are no longer dissolved within it. If you trace the arc of the empath's journey to this point, the transformation becomes unmistakable. From someone whose entire existence was outwardly referenced, constantly reacting and acculturating, they have become someone who can stay anchored within, while still fully engaging the world. And Jung regarded this exact balance as the summary of psychological maturity. Conclusion. So the day the empath stops caring, truly stops in that old, exhausting, reflexive way, is not the day they discard what was once most beautiful in them. It is the day they no longer need to use their sensitivity as a survival mechanism. And when that shift locks into place, they are no longer merely an empath. They become an individual, someone with a center, with boundaries, and with the capacity to be fully present without losing themselves. If you step back and survey the full arc of this trajectory, you may begin to perceive something wholly different from the story you once accepted. The empath does not lose heart when the old pattern ceases. They simply stop vanishing inside the act of loving. What once made them rare does not evaporate. It metamorphoses. It passes from unconscious flow into conscious presence, from compulsive giving into sovereign choice. And perhaps the deepest truth rests here. Only when they no longer need to prove they are good do they finally become whole. If this stirred something within you, take a moment. And if you're ready to continue walking your own path of awakening, you know what to do.